Hello and welcome to Analog Insights. In today's episode, Simon and I review the Canon P, a beautiful, well-designed 35mm rangefinder with the Leica thread mount or M39 mount and an unusual 1:1 viewfinder magnification. The camera was built between December 1958 and May 1961. It came in both a silver and a black version. The black version is much more rare and because of that also much more expensive, especially original black paint versions are really hard to get, and on the used market you find a lot of repainted ones. The silver version is much more widely available and because of that also cheaper, and the camera in general is quite accessible if you look at the prices. The camera originally was marketed as a less expensive version of the Canon VI-L and was named Canon P with the P standing for Populaire, so it really aspired to becoming a very popular camera and also turned out to become that for Canon, a bestseller at the end. And back then, according to the Canon Museum, there were two versions. One selling with a 50mm f1.4 lens, which is also called the Japanese Sumilux, which we have here and which we reviewed here on the channel before. And then there was the alternative, the f2.8, the slower version, and they came in kits. And the one kit was available for the 52,700 yen, that was the better one, so to speak, and the lower end version was for 37,700 yen for the 2.8 kit. And translating that to US dollars back then, the high end version, so to speak, cost 146 US dollars back then, which would translate to around 1,460 US dollars today. And the lower end version was around 105 US dollars, so 1,050 US dollars today, depending of course on inflation and when you're looking at this video. What is interesting is that it was only possible to make it less expensive because primarily of the viewfinder. They simplified the viewfinder. The VI-L had a switch where you could switch between the different frame lines and the different magnifications fitting to the lens that you adapted, and here you had a 1:1 magnification and all the frame lines displayed at all times, so you always see the frame lines for the 35mm, 50mm and 100mm here. According to Peter Deckard's excellent Canon Rangefinder Cameras book, about 87,875 Canon Ps were built. He's mentioning in the introduction that he's rounding a little bit, but this number should be fairly accurate. And the Canon P is the predecessor to the very successful Canon VII, which had a built-in light meter. This one here, the Canon P, does not have a built-in light meter, but we will talk about the features a bit more in a minute. Simon and I took the camera out to Lindau, which is sitting nicely in between Austria, Germany and Switzerland. He was driving all the way up from Switzerland and I came from Munich, and we spent a very nice day there shooting some Kodak Pro Image 100 and Kodak Portra 160. We were a little bit unlucky with the weather. Had some kind of storm coming in with a lot of hail and rain suddenly. So we were really lucky that we shot most of our scenes and most of the roads before the big storm came. But here you can see how it started and then how it was suddenly going. So let's dive in there and take a closer look at the beautiful Canon P. So let's get some historical context first. Canon was founded in 1933 and focused on creating affordable 35mm cameras for the Japanese market. After an initial phase of experimentation and also drawing inspiration from Nikon, which at the time was still called Nippon Kogaku, and which had already started out in 1917, Canon focused increasingly on creating high-quality copies of the Leica II camera, which were called Canon, so with a K and W in the beginning, and which then also became the foundation for the later name. And they really mastered that, so over time they became known as the best manufacturer, or the manufacturer creating the best copies of the Leica II and Leica III cameras. Next to these sophisticated copies, Canon also pushed innovation and developed a reputation for being a really great optics and camera manufacturer. And from a collector perspective, it is interesting that Canon only introduced model identification numbers in 1956, which is why books like Peter Deckard's Canon Rangefinders from 1933 to 1968 are such a valuable resource in navigating Canon's history, and it helped me personally tremendously in better understanding this whole lineup. Because if you just look online, to be honest, a lot of people are not quoting their sources correctly or not really knowing their sources well and double checking information and so on. So you get a mix of inconsistent pieces of information. Also sometimes model names are just pulled together. And here in this book, it's really straightforward. Back then when the book was released in 1985, he talked to all sorts of original sources, Canon historians on site, people working for Canon, and you can really feel that all the knowledge that was pulled into that book, and until today it remains a really high quality resource. Going back to the history, Canon would then continue to evolve the original Leica design that they were copying and adding features, making it better, improving it over time. And increasingly these models look less like the original and more like an original Canon camera. And arguably with the introduction of the Canon VT in 1956, you really got a new top and bottom plate on the camera, which had a unique, really nice design. You had a trigger style film advance, which of course was very fast, and an integrated self-timer that was completely redesigned and redone. And this camera arguably really put Canon on the map as a company that not just has a strong reputation as a company creating and pushing innovation, but really being able to bring something completely new to the market. And with that reputation in the background, when the predecessor of the Canon P was released in 1958, the Canon VI-L, it was really considered one of the best designed and best looking cameras on the market back then and in the world back then. And until today among collectors, it has a really high reputation. So this Canon VI-L is well known for its high build quality, its excellent design, and its also long list of features and overall durability that makes it still heavily sought after among collectors today. And in that context, the Canon P was released as mentioned before, as a less expensive alternative, but can still be considered among the Canon rangefinders or the pinnacle of the Canon rangefinder lineup. And as intended and suggested by its name, it really became a truly popular camera for Canon. To put some numbers on it, Canon sold twice as many Ps as with any previous other model, and yet it was released in a very competitive market. That is important to understand. Leica had introduced the M2 as a less expensive alternative to the very successful M3 at the time, and Nikon had introduced the S3. And Leica, of course, already had the new M mount, while the Canon P was still focusing on the Leica thread mount, so the old mount, which of course had advantages because there were still a lot of lenses available and people still had these old lenses at times. But Leica was really pushing the new innovative M mount with new lenses and so on. And of course there was heavy competition. And Peter Deckard in his book notes, quote, "The Canon P might have received more critical respect had the Leica M2 II and Nikon S3 not preceded it. It was nevertheless a solid, honest camera which merited its popular sales success. Furthermore, the P's introduction coincided with a shift on the market to single-lens reflex cameras, which became much more interesting and popular at the time. And in many markets, or most markets, the Canon P was simultaneously introduced with the Canon Flex. And since that had been highly anticipated by many people, of course, it initially outsold the Canon P. But then over time, the Canon P ended up outlasting and outselling the Canon Flex and its two immediate successors. So it became, as intended by Canon, a really popular camera and quite a sales success. And that is great for us today as either collectors or just shooters of vintage rangefinder cameras, because it's widely available and has quite an accessible entry price level at the moment. Let's see how that develops, of course. But these are cameras from the late 50s and early 1960s that have great value until today, because they were just built in a way that is not done anymore. So what about the features and the design of the Canon P? Next to the classic Leica M design, I would argue that the Canon P is one of the most beautiful 35mm rangefinders out there. The design is straightforward, simple and minimalist. In terms of buttons and dials, you only have what is really essential, and each of the items is beautifully designed in itself. And even the Canon logo here in the front is super clean and nice. And in terms of build quality, you can really feel how much craftsmanship went into that, and on what kind of high quality standard it was produced back then. But what about the features? The camera comes with a horizontally traveling focal plane shutter made of metal with speeds ranging from 1 second to 1/1000th of a second, plus a bulb mode and an X-Sync mode for flash with 1/55th of a second as flash synchronization speed. The coated stainless steel shutter is known to develop wrinkles over time, which is not a quality issue at all and doesn't affect its performance. But when you look at a used model, don't be surprised by that. You will hardly find anyone, or you will have a hard time finding any model that has no wrinkles in it. The reason why Canon introduced is that the Kloss alternatives, also built in the Leica M, for instance, have the disadvantage that if you are walking around on a sunny day with, for instance, like we did, around a lake, you get a lot of reflections, very bright reflections coming through the lens that then would potentially burn holes into the Kloss shutter. And Canon wanted to avoid that, and that's why they introduced the stainless steel version here. And of course, that is a very smart move, and also the shutter still works perfectly fine after such a long time. The large shutter speed dial on the top where you can set the shutter is very comfortable, but when you look through the viewfinder, you don't get any indication of the selected shutter speed or the aperture that you set. And yet, if you kind of know what your typical point would be or look at it and then start to manipulate it, you can still keep the camera up at your eyes when shooting. The shutter release button is threaded and can be used in combination with a cable release, and many people also add a soft release button to this one here. Personally, I find that it's not needed, but many people do it for this particular camera. Around the shutter button is a ring marked A and then an unmarked dot. The unmarked dot is for the rewind mode, so whenever you want to rewind your film, you should set it to that unmarked section here. And when you put it to A, it's basically the normal film advance mode. Next to it, you have an automatic frame counter, the film advance lever, of course, and a little window with a red dot indicating that your film is being transported correctly or also rewound correctly. The viewfinder is bright and clean and features 3 silvered Albada frame lines for 35mm, 50mm and 100mm, which are visible at all times. The viewfinder comes with an unusual 1:1 viewfinder magnification, as briefly mentioned, which makes it theoretically possible to shoot with both eyes open, since there's no gap in between here. And if you compare that to the largest viewfinder magnification in the Leica M lineup, which would be that of the M3 with a 0.91 times magnification, that is of course interesting. And of course that one didn't support the 35mm frame lines. So here you can also see that it makes much more sense to compare the Canon P with its frame lines and viewfinder to the M2, which also featured frame lines for 35mm, 50mm, and then in the Leica context 90mm instead of the 100. But in this case you had a 0.72 times magnification, and here you can also guess the difference already, and that is true. In the case of the Canon P, the 35mm frame lines are really quite far towards the edge of what is visible, versus in the Leica M2, even the 35mm are easily visible and you still have a lot of free space around them. The rangefinder patch is easy to see in most situations, yet the old finders are a bit prone to flaring and creating situations where it's a little bit harder to see. The coupled rangefinder has a base length of 41mm, if that is interesting to you, and so it also means you can easily focus quite correctly. And the coupled rangefinder also features a parallax correction, which is really nice. So you can basically see the frame lines moving when you're focusing closer to a subject, and always ensure that what you're seeing in terms of the frame lines, the indication that you get, will also be on your final frame. Might be interesting to some of you who are prone to tinkering that apparently the horizontal and vertical rangefinder calibration can be knocked off easily, and nevertheless you can calibrate these yourselves using this little small screw that is hidden underneath the bigger outer screw, which sounds difficult, but apparently, based on what Simon told me, he has done that before. It's not that tricky. You can do that, and there are also some instructions online of how to calibrate the rangefinder if you need to. The back is very clean and only features an ASA or ISO dial, which of course is only as a reminder, because there's no built-in light meter, there's no connection to a light meter. It maxes out at 1600, but still for most cases it will be fine as a reminder. And at the bottom is a particularly secure lock system that prevents you from opening up the camera and exposing your film through the back if you don't want to. So you basically have first you have to rotate the key here at the bottom, which moves the safety latch out of the way, and then you can pull down the conventional opening latch on the side and open up the back to remove or replace the film. The Canon P has a standard Prontor Compur, so PC sync connector here on the side, which makes it compatible with modern electronic flashes and the studio system. And the PC sync ports around is designed to lock on a vintage Canon flashbulb unit as well, but of course that is not so relevant anymore. The vintage one had the advantage that it allows a shutter speed synchronization even up to the camera's maximum of 1/1000th of a second. As the Canon P comes with a Leica thread mount, you theoretically have access to all sorts of vintage lenses, since practically all camera manufacturers except Pentax created rangefinder lenses at some point. So you have lenses from Canon, of course, Leica, Nikon, Schneider Kreuznach, Zeiss, and so on. So really a lot of alternatives that you can tap into. But you should be careful that certain wide-angle lenses and especially collapsible lenses are incompatible with the Canon P, as they might interfere with the light baffles and or the metal shutter, especially for the collapsible ones. So you should always briefly check for compatibility with the Canon P briefly, but the general rule of thumb is that it is compatible with almost all vintage lenses. When looking at modern lenses, it becomes a little bit more difficult, as there are not so many manufacturers anymore who produce these Leica thread mount lenses. For instance, Vogtländer and Lomography come to mind, and we here used Vogtländer Color f2.5 MC lens, a really modern lens that could be easily adapted to the Canon P and works perfectly fine and produces these really modern and clean results. So if that is your intention, you should maybe check first what lenses would be available for the Leica thread mount before making that jump and taking a Canon P. Personally, of course, I find that the vintage look makes perfect sense for such a camera, and then it's also great to be able to tap into a wide variety of really nice lenses. As always with vintage lenses, you should take a closer look at how good is the condition, but if you find ones in great condition, you can also create excellent results until today with these lenses. The most important original accessory is probably the selenium light meter that could be put here on top and connect via the hot shoe to the camera, and then also be connected directly with the shutter speed dial. As you can see here, it has these characteristic dents, and these were to couple it with the selenium light meter that you could put on top of it. So a really nice original accessory, and of course for collectors, especially the black versions with fitting black original light meter are heavily sought after. But as a modern alternative, you can also just go for the camera and then look for something that we had here, like the Dumo Meter D, as a really nice modern alternative that worked perfectly fine, and as you could see, even matches in terms of color, and you hardly notice that this is such a modern light meter on such a late 1950s, early 1960s camera. So in my opinion, a beautiful setup, and for us it worked wonders in terms of getting a correct exposure. From a collector's perspective, it's also important to mention the special editions. There was one for the Japanese self-defense forces that had a bunch of cherries engraved on top, but the most important one is probably the one for the 25th anniversary of Canon that was introduced in 1962, and that featured the Canon Eagle engraved on the top plate. And only a very limited number of these were created and then passed on to loyal Canon employees, so those who had worked for the company for quite some time. And of course, these are incredible from a collector perspective. If retaining the vintage look of your camera and getting original accessories is not your thing at all, and you're open to experimentation, then you can also move in a completely different direction thanks to basically custom shops like Shuedo Camera in Taiwan, who are doing an incredible job of offering, if you want, fully cleaned, lubricated and adjusted Canon Ps with fitting lenses in the custom color that you want them to have. So they offer versions that feature some kind of brassing look that really looks incredibly beautiful in my opinion, but you can also have more interesting and unconventional designs. Like this white and orange one that we have here. You can have certain blue tones in combination with gold if you want that. So all sorts of designs are possible, and the prices are fair in my opinion. And they not just offer that service for Canon Ps, but also for other camera models. So you can also do that to Leicas if you want to. But especially in my opinion for these Canon Ps, it really fits beautifully. And they do ship internationally and to Europe, which is really dangerous if you are like me and are easily caught by these kinds of beautiful mixtures of taking well-developed, high-quality vintage piece and then customizing it through such a paint job. And yeah, especially if you get these cameras fully CL8, it's a really nice overall offering. So if you're interested in that, take a look at the Shuedo Camera Instagram account as an alternative to the all-vintage design. So what about the handling and our personal impressions? In our opinion, the Canon P is a fantastic choice if you are a 50mm focal length shooter. So if that is your preferred focal length, like in the case of Simon and myself, then this camera is fantastic because of the limited amount of other frame lines that are being displayed. And as Simon pointed out, the 100mm ones that are always present are even for him like a rule of thirds indicator in his 50mm composition, and I found that very smart. I would have never thought of that, to use it like that, but he's basically taking the 100mm frame lines into consideration when shooting his 50mm composition. And as mentioned, since the 35mm are so far towards the edge of the finder and are barely visible in the first place, they are also not a nuisance when it comes to shooting it. With the 50mm lens, they are only a nuisance if you are wearing glasses and shoot a 35mm lens. Then in my opinion, they are much better rangefinders. If 35mm is your preferred focal length, then the Canon P is probably not ideal, and you should definitely first take a look and try it before taking the jump and purchasing it. In terms of construction, the P and its predecessors are just incredible, and as briefly touched on before, really can be considered the high point in the Canon rangefinder lineup. The heavy chrome plating, the solid material, and the fine craftsmanship can be felt at all times, and the metal shutter here in this case also add to that. What is also relevant from a CLA perspective is that you don't have any kind of foam that is typically in these kinds of cameras to prevent light leaks, and you might know that when you purchase a camera used, you typically have to replace the foam at some point, and either do that yourself using some kind of tutorial or have some capable professional do it for you. And in this case, because it's all in there with these well-constructed light baffles, and there's no need for any kind of foam in the Canon P, and you have a reduced CLA effort naturally. Personally, I also really like that there are specialists out there like Shuedo Camera, which sell these custom painted perfectly CL8 camera, so you can really treat yourself to a really nice camera that is custom made and it's unique to your own to your own needs, and still pay significantly less than you would for any Leica M or LTM body out there, which is of course incredible and has to do with the market conditions, but which is worth pointing out. So if customization is important to you and getting a really nice CL8 camera and not have to worry and still not breaking the bank, then the Canon P is also something that I can highly recommend. Personally, I also found the rotating red dot indicating whether your film is being transported correctly a really nice touch and a nice alternative to what you typically have, like looking at your film rewind and whether it's advancing. So here you just have it as a built-in feature. And the only small downside is that there's no built-in light meter, unlike to the later Canon 7 series. But if fine craftsmanship is important to you, I would always recommend to go for the earlier models like the Canon P and its predecessors. And recommend to just work with a modern light meter. There are all sorts of alternatives. We used the Dumo here and really liked it. If you are considering getting your first rangefinder camera, basically, I can highly recommend taking a look at the Canon P and its prices as an alternative to the very expensive Leica M and also many Oscar Barnack Leicas that are out there. Personally, I think it's a really great rangefinder, especially if you're shooting 50mm lenses. It's a really nice option. So, thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Analog Insights and our review of the Canon P. In our opinion, an excellent choice for shooting 50mm lenses. You get a wide range of lenses, LTM lenses that you can tap into, especially vintage, modern, not so much, a little bit more difficult. And you get a beautifully designed, well-crafted camera that doesn't usually need a lot of CLA and can be easily calibrated if something is off with your rangefinder, for instance. So we hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, please remember to like it and maybe even share it with your friends. And if you want to see more videos like this, please subscribe to our channel. Jules, Greg, and I really appreciate each and every subscriber coming our way. So thanks for watching. I hope to see you soon. Bye.